So I want to thank everybody for coming here today. It was really great to follow AI because I think every conversation I've had over the last year has either been AI or GLP-1s. So it's definitely two topics that are top of mind for everybody at this point. We have an amazing panel. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Just to introduce myself, I'm a benefits consultant, so I deal with HR benefits people on a daily basis. And as I said before, I would say 90% of the conversations are around the GLP-1 medications. So we're going to talk today about the GLP-1 medications. We're going to focus on 4 different aspects. We're going to focus on understanding the hype. We're going to focus on being smart and responsible for coverages, the ROI and the financial impact to organizations, as well as how do you plan for the future. With that being said, I'll let the panel introduce themselves. We'll start off with AJ and then go down.
Thank you so much. I'm AJ Loiacono, the CEO of Capital RX. For those who are unfamiliar with our organization, we have 2 core businesses. We're a full-service PBM on one side of the house that services employers, unions, municipalities, et cetera. Other side of the house, we're a software technology platform for claim administration, and our clients there are Blues plans, regional health plans, and TPAs.
Hi, my name is Dr. Disha Narang. I am an endocrinologist and director of obesity medicine at Endeavor Health, just here in Chicago. I am almost a full-time clinician, and obesity medicine is something I live and breathe every single day.
Hi, I'm Shawn, Gremminger, President and CEO of the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchaser Coalitions. We are a national trade association that represents regional employer purchaser coalitions around the country. Each of them have employers as members, ranging from the very largest Fortune 500 companies down to 100, 200 person self-insured companies. We just updated our numbers actually, and we sort of taking all of the employers in all of our different networks. We have something like 90 million covered lives, so a majority of people in the self-insured, in the employer market.
Awesome. So as you guys can see, we have a very vast panel over here. We will be taking questions, so if you do have a question in the middle, feel free to raise your hand and we'll have a mic come over so we can actually hear your questions. But to dive right in, we're talking about the GLP-1 medications, and you can't turn on the TV without seeing them. I live in New York City. You can't get in the subway without seeing an advertisement for them. I'll start off with you, Dr. Narang. Do they work? Is it a fad? Is it short-term? Are there long-term side effects? Is it something that's going to go away? I just asked 5 questions in one, but is it worth the hype?
So just to back up a little bit, obesity is something that we need to start seeing as a chronic disease. And so one thing that has really taken off, with the media, social media, is sort of the emphasis on the vanity aspect. And that's something that has created sort of the problem with the shortages and difficulty with coverage and everything, just because the demand has become so significant that I don't think, 4 or 5 years ago we would have ever anticipated this. But kind of taking a step back, obesity is a neurohormonal process. Most patients that come to see me have tried everything under the sun to get weight off. They're not there, to try to get into a fancy dress that's 10 or 15 pounds away from their goal. It's not necessarily something of a vanity that we talk about. We talk about metabolic disease. And so, when I am seeing patients, they're having issues with heart disease, liver disease, diabetes, obviously the list goes on, and we have obviously more and more data supporting the long-term benefit of GLPs. We have used GLP-1 agonists for about 20 years in the diabetes space, and now, of course, 6 to 8 years ago, we started getting approvals for GLP-1s in the weight management space. So we have a lot of experience with these. People think that they're new, but they're not that new. Side effects typically are GI related, some stomach upset, indigestion, nausea, but most of the studies are showing about 95 to 96% of patients can tolerate the medication even at the highest dose. We're not seeing long-term complications from this. And in fact, we're seeing long-term benefit, so cardiac benefit. We have FDA indication for Wegovy in patients who've had cardiac events or stroke. We have FDA indication for patients for Zepbound who have a history of moderate to severe sleep apnea and obesity. And so we're seeing more and more trials. FDA indications are likely to follow as those trials get implemented. And so all in all, this has been really positive. What's been more difficult, obviously, has been the landscape of shortages and, of course, now insurance coverage.
So to follow up on that, I'll answer the rest of the panel. Obviously, so this miracle drug, or I'll call it a miracle drug, works. But we're seeing the fact that it is advertised everywhere, the fact that you can't get on a subway car in New York City without seeing it leads to overuse, overdiagnosis, people asking for it. I'll start off from the pharmacy standpoint, and then we'll go to the medical standpoint, but how is that influencing the stigma around it, the cost, the utilization of it? How have we seen it being manipulated in those regards based on advertisement and the marketing of it? AJ, you want to go first?
Sure. I always want to point out we probably wouldn't be having this panel if the drug was reasonably priced. If the average cost of a drug in the United States is $130, if it was in that sweet spot, most people wouldn't care. It would be just another therapy. I think the other problem is if you turn to our developed nation partners, they pay a fraction of the price. So anywhere from $80 to $120 back to average cost of our medication in the United States in that sweet spot. And so I think the first part is I equate a lot of what I do from, what I would say pure mathematics. And I often think of casino odds. And so when you place a GLP-1 into your formulary for obesity management, or even not, and people are moving from generics to branded product to get access, my point there becomes is if the price of the drug net cost is $600, it's 5x the average cost of a drug in a plant. And so, when someone says, hey, should I put this in here, what should I be anticipating? I would be like, for every 1% of utilization, it's 5 to 6% trend. That's a real significant number when you're trying to maintain, at best, a sub 7% trend. You're just telling me 1% of utilization is going to shift this. And so, this is a significant problem for most employers in the United States. And I always go back to it depends on the profile of the organization. I have companies that are Fortune 10 clients. I have mid-market clients. I have municipalities, unions. If you're wealthy enough as an employer and you just say cover it all because you make a couple $2 billion net a quarter, who cares? Thankfully you have a wonderful program. For the rest of America, or the other 90% that are struggling with cost trend, this is a really big question. And so it goes to, I believe, based upon the data, there's certainly efficacy of this drug and benefits to it, but the question is who pays? So in America, if the average employee cycle is 3 to 4 years and you're out, but the long-term value or the total cost of care shows up in years 7, 8, and 9, unless you are a union or you have really high stickiness as a municipality and state or government workers, most people, if you're just doing the math, you don't want to cover this because you never see the benefit. You just hope at one point the tide hits a median in which there are enough people on it and enough people not on it that it's no longer impacting your trend. And so, I try and approach things without emotion, and I try and just counsel people based upon what the math teaches us and trains us to look at. And depending upon your profile and demographic, that is a very different story for every employer group, and I want people to remember that. There's not one catch-all answer to this.
So I'm going to push back on that, but before I do, I want to hear from Shawn and his opinion on this.
Yeah, so I'm actually with AJ on this, so we'll talk more. But so it's the price, stupid. I mean, ultimately, that's what this is all about. AJ is absolutely right. I was at a employer event here in Chicago about a year ago. Had large employers, medium-sized employers from all over this area because it was a regional event for one of my coalitions. And we were having all of these same discussions, cost effectiveness and benefit, and when are we going to see it, and how much does it impact employee retention, and all that stuff. And then one of my sort of smarter colleagues asked the simple question: if these drugs were priced at the price of a statin, would we even be here? Would we even be talking about these things? And every employer in the room, there was 20 or so, all of them were like, no, we would just cover it. We would just cover it. We know statins work. We know they're necessary. We would just cover it. But when you're talking about something that can increase your medical spend significantly, you have to have these conversations. And it's frustrating from the employer perspective to feel like now we have to be the bad guys because the drug makers and the PBMs are being greedy, and we have to be the ones who say no. So I did a little bit of lit review before this panel, and I just want to stipulate I am not a clinician, but I can read lit reviews. ICER in 2022 found that lifetime cost to be on a GLP-1 would be $274,000 a person. Lifetime medical expense reduction, $62,000. The New England Journal of Medicine had a study in 2022 that said if 100 people were on a GLP-1 for 3 years, so 300 people for 3 years, you would avoid one major cardiovascular event. JAMA just this year did a study looking at Medicare coverage of GLP-1s, found that the coverage would cost Medicare $66 billion in 2035, so at the last year of a 10-year window, and would see medical savings of $18 billion, so a net cost of $48 billion. There's an argument to be made that we should still cover them, even if you don't have ROI. But I think if we just say, oh yeah, no, there's definitely ROI, I think we're ignoring the science that seems to be out there. I will say Aon just came out with a study, I don't know, earlier this couple weeks ago, and they said they looked at all of their claims, so Aon's a big consultant broker, and said that in the first year they saw costs went up, but in the second year, a substantial portion of people who were on GLP-1s actually were having real benefits in terms of their overall cost trend, significantly fewer cardiovascular events, all that stuff. And for the rest of the population, the sort of matched population, so other people with obesity, et cetera, their medical trend was 14% year over year, and for the people on GLP-1s, it was 7%. That's really promising. I will also say I don't trust anything Aon says when it comes to prescription drug pricing because they are in the business of selling prescription drugs. So when they tell you tell an employer you should probably sign up for GLP-1s, they're probably looking out for their own bottom line. So I just think employers have to be really thoughtful about how they want to do this. And one of the things I want to talk about is sort of like, what are those middle ground options between, yes, cover everything and lose your shirt, and no, don't cover anything and deny real access to people who clearly could use and benefit from the drug.
So first of all, I love hearing don't listen to Aon because they are my competition. But besides that, focusing on this, and I want to push back, as I said beforehand. So the topic we're talking about is how are payers and employers covering the cost. So what I'm seeing from a lot of my clients, and I'd love your opinion on this, is 100%. If you're looking at it from a pure dollars and cents ROI on that standpoint, does this lower my claims and my medical spend versus does this add to my medical spend? I agree with that. What we're seeing companies do is open up several books. If you take a look, and Dr. Narang, I'll ask you to comment on this, the fact that these medications are working are creating a healthier workforce. A healthier workforce is a more productive workforce. When an employee is able to walk up a flight of stairs healthier and show up at the office feeling better, more confident, their productivity and their response and their activity at work goes up, which creates multiple aspects. When you're trying to attract or retain and one employer is offering, another is not, it's a huge selling point. So from a pure ROI, from a dollars to cents, one line item versus another, I 100% agree, it's questions there. But I think if you open up and look at those several line items, you can possibly find ways to fund this based on increased productivity, increased health, lack of taking days off, so on and so forth. So I'll start with you, Doctor, and then I'd love to hear everybody else's comments on that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. In this country, diabetes and obesity cost us $2.4 trillion a year in absenteeism and presenteeism. So that's significant, right? I don't disagree with the fact that obviously this is a very big spend for an employer to figure out in terms of benefits for their employees. However, it's not benefits 3 to 5 years out from starting a GLP. Our data actually shows benefits as early as a year and a half, up to 2 years. And all the data that actually got us some of these FDA indications are studies less than 2 years of length. And so possibly, yes, attrition rates are varied depending on the employer employee, but if we're sticking to data, we actually are seeing benefits within 18 to 24 months, and these are significant cardiac benefits. So if we look at the SELECT trial for Wegovy, we saw a 20% MACE reduction, which is major acute coronary event reduction by 20% in patients that were enrolled in that trial, and this was less than 2 years. And so I'm seeing this day in and day out. I'm seeing the disability that it's causing. More likely than not, that level of disability is costing our medical system much more over time. There are insurance policies that will cover bariatric surgery much sooner than they will cover this medication. But yes, I also agree that there has been a lot of frivolous use of the medication. I think there's been a lot of inappropriate use. I think that, again, it's being used as a vanity piece for a lot of patients, and unfortunately, that group has ruined it for the pack. So, here we are, but for those of us fighting the good fight, this is a disease that deserves treatment, and there are patients that are actively facing shortened lifespans because of the sheer nature of their weight. Just by having class 1 or obesity or above, patients are at a 40 to 50% increased chance of a cardiac event, excluding any other metabolic conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, what have you. And so just by their weight alone, they are at higher risk and are likely to cost this healthcare system much more in the long run.
Anybody?
So I certainly don't want to go toe-to-toe with the actual clinician physician on this stuff, on the medical science. I think, for me, two things. Get into the question of how are employers sort of covering the cost. I absolutely agree with your point, Harrison, that employers can and maybe should think more broadly about it. This isn't just a matter of sort of what our medical trend would suggest is the right move, because in most of the cases, the answer is probably don't cover it. That would be the recommendation I would make. I'm just a lobbyist. I'm not an advisor. But there are a lot of other benefits, and particularly around recruitment and retention. And we've actually surveyed our employers, and then a lot of them have said that they see this as a significant recruitment and retention tool. So that's totally reasonable. The irony is, if you kind of look at within the commercial space, the employer market, the companies that have the most people who could benefit from GLP-1s tend to not be Google and Amazon and the places that can afford it the most, right? It tends to be people who are somewhat lower on the SES scale. It tends to be people who are municipal workers, school districts, manufacturers, companies that are a little bit tighter, which gets back to the cost problem, right? It gets back to what can we do to try to get the cost down? So, employers are, I think, engaging in different sort of medication management. They're saying, okay, look, we can't afford it for everybody, but we'll cover it for people with a BMI above 37, right? And we'll sort of work our way down the BMI scale. The thing that I think is the most promising is pairing coverage of BMI with a really active lifestyle management program. There are a lot of different vendors out there that do this. I'm not recommending necessarily any of them, although I would defer to others. But this idea that we know that the drugs work significantly better as people change their lifestyle, and the drugs help people change their lifestyle. And I've talked to a lot of people on GLP-1s, and they've talked about how much easier it is to eat healthy, to be active when you're actually engaging in a lifestyle management program and on a GLP-1. That can help to make sure that the right people are getting the drugs and that they're actually seeing real benefit of it, rather than the sort of type of vanity opportunities that are out there. Those cost marginally some money because you have to pay somebody else to sort of manage the care for this population. But the net savings in terms of not just handing out GLP-1s to anybody who sort of manages to get a script can be pretty significant.
You want to?
Yeah, I think the thing that I always want to point out is that when you're trying to prove out a total cost of care evaluation, most employers are sadly ill-prepared for the data collection side of this. So, if you walk the numbers very quickly, you say, hey, if pharmacy's 1x and medical premiums 5x and salaries 10x, and this is your total cost of care ratios. So if I have my pharmacy go up 5%, I need to save maybe 1% on the medical side to make it equivalent. And gosh golly, if I could get 1% on time and attendance, we're now, back in the black. And so I think I always want to point out to people is whenever we have this discussion, because we do collect this data when it's available, it's horribly inaccurate. You know, the only people that really keep good time and attendance are like hospitals, attorneys for billable hours and their staff, municipalities, unions, especially hourly union workers, many of them pay into their benefits down to the hour, and they are very well prepared, but this is going to be shocking. A lot of high-tech companies, banking companies, financial industry, horrible data. And they would say things like, we really don't track it. We don't want to really, it's privacy. And I'm like, well, if you ever want to get to total cost of care, you're going to have to do this work. And so I think people overlook this all the time, and they don't even know where their data is. They're like, that might be with Workday on time and attendance. My Ben admin system might have some medical information. Pharmacies with the PBM, is that the invoice or the claim record? It's everywhere. And so, you know, again, I think that there's merit to a discussion, but people need to put in the work, people being the employers.
So I'm going to pivot slightly at this point. So let's say for argument's sake, organizations decide to cover it. Medical has beaten over financial, or HR has beaten over finance in this conversation. So let's be smart about this. We know that it's being overprescribed, as we mentioned beforehand. We know that there's advertisements everywhere. As an organization, how can you prevent fraud? How can you make sure that the right people are taking it and taking the right dosages? And it's a huge expense. How can we limit the expense as much as possible from an organizational standpoint? AJ, I'll start with you and we'll go down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I'll punt on fraud. I mean, I always like to say, doctor, do no harm, and you know they're going to do the right thing in this equation. But I want to talk about waste. You know, this is something that I uncover all the time when I look at claims data, which is, you know, so someone goes, hey, we're going to cover this or have limited coverage of this, but it immediately gets kicked off to the mail center because they're going to say, hey, this is an injectable, it's covered as a specialty, it's going to go through my exclusive mail facility or exclusive channels. And one of the things that we look at, because we reply to over 800 RFPs each year on the PBM side, and I get 800 servings of data, and one of the first things we go to is the patient journey and medication possession ratios. And what we find quite often is that one patient is on 2 or 3 different GLP-1s at the same time. How is that even possible? And I always like to point this out. The PBM can block this at any time. That is a very simple drug to drug check, rudimentary in fact, but hey, if people make money on drug spend, all waste is good waste because they make a % on drug spend. Second thing is medication possession ratios that are 130, 140%. They're shipping product every 50 to 60 days on a 90-day fill. By the end of the year, that is an absolute mess. And so waste is a huge part of taking out of this process. You know, we could talk about long-term value, we could talk about efficacy, we could talk about the fraud prevention, and I'm sure, you know, my panel guests here with me will say the same thing is, but I always want to make this very clear is there is millions of dollars in an average size plan of just waste going out the door, and it's because someone just thinks they must be doing the right thing. And if one thing I've been taught over the years in healthcare is vigilance never goes away.
Shawn?
Well, I 100% agree with AJ in terms of the waste that we see. You know, there's a reason why, and I'm just going to sound like I'm advertising for each of you. Aon sucks. AJ's competitors suck. There's a reason why places like Capital RX can make money despite the fact that they don't have the volume of sort of the big 3 PBMs, and that's because they don't engage. I'll stipulate for the purpose of this conversation. They don't engage in the kind of behavior that larger PBMs do, which is, as you said, when you're making a lot of money on prescribing overpriced drugs, you want to prescribe, or not prescribe, you want to fill more overpriced scripts, right? We see it a lot, and I think, actually it was the first time I had ever heard, when AJ mentioned this on the prep call, that we saw people that had multiple GLP-1s being filled, which is just absurd. I mean, there's a lot of times where you see lots of drugs that you're like, I'm not really sure why that person should be taking these 3 different things in combination. That seems to be problematic. But like the same drug 3 times over from different manufacturers, maybe being filled, you know, different or different prescriptions, et cetera, is really problematic. I do think that there are, as I said, a smart policy for an employer that is trying to kind of find this balance is being very targeted with the population that they're trying to take care of, and then making sure they have kind of all of the wraparound services they need to be successful. And again, a lot of times employers want to just sort of push the easy button and be like, cool, I'm going to hire a vendor to do this. And that can be effective. They could do it themselves. That could be effective. They could partner with a center of excellence. That could be effective. I don't have necessarily the right answer, but one of the things that we think makes sense, and I want to see if Dr. Narang agrees, is the idea that if you have a person who, let's say, has a very high BMI, 3740, right? They shouldn't just be getting a GLP-1 from their primary care physician, taking it home and injecting it once a week and doing nothing else, right? There should be a partner that they are working with, somebody who actually understands the science of obesity, understands the cardiometabolic things that are happening, and can really help manage that care and make sure that person is getting all the kind of wraparound services they need. Again, there's cost to doing that, but when you're talking about, this is maybe the one upside of the drugs being so expensive, for the employer, it's actually worth bearing that cost to try to make sure that that person is actually successful. And frankly, and this is going to sound very harsh, if you have a patient who just wants the GLP-1, they just want the easy button, they want to be able to just inject it once a week, drop 20% of their body weight and do nothing else, they're not going to be successful, they're going to end up dropping out. And that's sort of a failure of the system, but from the employer standpoint, they would at least say, well, at least I'm not wasting $1,000 a month on that person if it's not going to work.
So we all agreed that the reason we're sitting here today is because of the price of these drugs. So there is an alternative on the market right now currently that is significantly cheaper, and those are the compound drugs. Now, we'll put the legality behind the compound drugs aside for 1 second, or you can discuss it if you guys want. But I'll start off from the medical standpoint, then we'll go to the other standpoint. But the compound medications, are they a good, safe alternative for employers who want these results for their employees but can't afford the budget? And I'll start from the medical standpoint.
I'll be blunt about that, absolutely not. We have no safety or efficacy data on compounded agents. There is absolutely no standard in terms of testing for the safety or efficacy of these agents. So someone could tell me until they're blue in the face that, hey, this is great, this is a great product, this is safe, et cetera. What standard are we judging that against, right? When a pharmaceutical company goes to the FDA to get approval of a medication for a certain condition, there are so many standards of care and safety that they have to meet. The compounding industry is just out in left field doing this and saying that something is safe. So with the compounded agents, we've seen over a dozen deaths in the last couple years. The more severe side effects that we hear about in the press and all of that people are coming into the ERs with are more often due to compounded agents. There is a concern for something called immunogenicity, which means that patients might develop antibodies to the actual branded, patented molecule. So that means that they will not potentially respond to it. There have been reports of possible thromboembolism, so blood clots from some of the compounded agents. The list goes on. And so, out of pocket, those compounded agents, if you go to a med spa, for example, you'll get some nice, combination of some vitamin B12 mixed in with a God knows what kind of GLP they've been cooking up in the back, and you get that marketed for like $350 a month, or plus their special services that they might offer you, right? They're on every corner in Chicago here. But if you actually want to pay that much out of pocket, just buy the branded medication then for $500 a month, either via Novo Nordisk or Eli Lilly, right? The insurance doesn't have to play a part in this. But if that's the goal, then to each his own. But I agree with you in terms of we need to risk stratify patients. Those patients who combine that intense lifestyle modification with the medication are those that see that long-term success. All the studies were done in a setting of a reduced calorie diet and increased physical exercise to make sure that we saw those results that we did. And then I actually agree with you on this. And so in terms of that risk stratification, that needs to happen. What I will also just say, as I'm observing sort of all these changes in the market and coverage options and everything, is that insurance companies and employers, they need to consult a weight management specialist before they make some of these decisions, right? So here's what we're seeing. Let's say they have approved a patient with a BMI above 35 with a weight-related comorbidity, or a BMI above 40 without another comorbidity for a GLP-1. This is, by the way, the same criteria we use in the medical world for who might be eligible for bariatric surgery, but that's besides the point. So what's happening is, let's say this patient with a BMI of 45 has successfully started a GLP or GIP, GLP, and they have lost 50, 60 pounds. They're doing great. Their BMI is now down to 32. Now the insurance company will say, well, no, now you're down to class 1 obesity. We're going to stop the coverage of this medication. Then the patient pendulums back into class 2, class 3 obesity. I've seen this happen because in the last 6 months, this is exactly what we've been dealing with. They'll regain that 40, 50 pounds, they'll lose coverage. Or they'll regain it, then we'll fight again to kind of get it down. So the amount of paperwork, the amount of bandwidth it is taking to get someone who's actually legitimately benefiting from this medication to keep them on it has been absurd. And so, our nursing staff is drowning. Every system of healthcare is overburdened because of, so many changes and denials, and patients are upset, and who's in the middle? Us healthcare providers, right? We have no impact over, some of these changes that are happening, but again, for those of us fighting the good fight, I think that this is an important thing. And then there's also those who are, very frivolous about their use, as I mentioned. And just as an aside, we are a center of excellence. So these patients with, multiple GLPs and all of that, we don't see that because we have a standard of care that we plan to meet. And so I'm actually really dismayed that this is something that you are seeing commonly. So I'm learning from you today.
I mean, the only thing I would touch on is, I come from pharmaceutical manufacturing on the plant side, first 8 years of my career. Real dry work, that is. But, one of the things that you come to appreciate is the compliance required to operate any manufacturing at scale. And I think it's that last word, scale, that's so important to remember, which is, yes, it is a small molecule, and it is like a cookbook of chemistry 101. And you can probably make small batches of it fairly effectively, but I think the problem you're seeing is when people suddenly say, I'm in the manufacturing business, and I'm going to pump out 1,000 of these, 2,000 of these a month, 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, and these were never, ever going to be areas in which they could scale effectively, cleanly, safely. I think that's the concern I have here, which is, I understand the allure of the cost, but the thing I always want to go right back to pharma with is, if you're telling me Doug's Pharmacy can do this for $300, you and your state-of-the-art robotic factory can't do it for $100. Well, clearly you can, because you're willing to sell it to every other country for $100. So, yeah, I mean, this is a game of ping pong. Yes, I fault the unfortunate pharmacies that are taking advantage, and health spas and everything else, to sell you this, and it does not have the safety that you should be looking at. But the other side of it is, well, if they can do it cheaper, why the heck can't pharma? And the answer is, of course they can.
If I can just add real quick, agree with you on compounded drugs. We don't recommend it to employers for all kinds of reasons. A big one, frankly, is just the legal liability. If you're the plan that said, yes, go down to Doug's and get your drugs done there because it's cheaper, and you end up dying, now the company is on the hook for a very large lawsuit, and probably legitimately. I did, in my little lit review, there was actually a study in JAMA that found the cost of producing a single vial of semaglutide, just the actual marginal production cost, was $2.80, of which $2.50 was the pen. So the actual active ingredient cost, et cetera, was 30 cents. I'm not suggesting that we should be trying to make GLP-1s $3, but $100 doesn't sound terrible. And frankly, you can do it in Germany.
I would love those margins. I have the inverted margins as an administrator. And so I'm right there with you. I just think there needs to be some responsibility in a moment that pharma looks in the mirror here and says, you need to find equilibrium in your pricing.
So we can all go on this conversation, others forever. We have about 10 minutes left. So I do have a couple more questions I want to get to, but I want to ask the audience if there are any questions from the audience before we go through a couple of other questions. If you have a question, raise your hand.
The answer is Doug's Pharmacy is fictitious.
And Aon is still bad to listen to.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the coverage so far. I'm representing the providers that Dr. Narang just went through on the ping pong table every day. That's what we see, patients frustrated that they're not covered, or patients covered for some time and then back to square one. The challenges we have are multifold here, but what I'm trying to find is a solution, which is what would be the best scenario for the physicians to be able to engage the patients in so that they can seriously consider the lifestyle changes and diet that need to go with them day in, day out. So even if they're off the coverage, hopefully, some of that is going to help them maintain that weight. On the flip side is, what are the employers going to approve on? So whether it's a lifestyle program as a multi-step therapy or a few other things that'll help us as providers to really structure it so that there is a win-win, at least until these prices stop coming down.
Doctor.
So in terms of that maintenance of weight, I always say weight maintenance is just as much of a success for the patient as that initial weight loss itself. So now we have seen in multiple studies, particularly if we're talking about GLPs, STEP 4 and SURMOUNT-4, when patients have been taken off of the medication, they regain their weight. And so there's no such thing as weight maintenance post-therapy on just diet exercise. Patients will regain weight. That's how our neurohormonal system works. Maybe they'll be able to keep it off for a little while, but eventually our ghrelin hormones start to go up, and this is just physiology. Again, it is really, really important, again, as we mentioned, that for long-term success, when we marry all of this, intense lifestyle modifications plus, medical therapy, that's when we see success. But this is long-term here, right? This is chronic therapy. We don't think of diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, sleep apnea. We don't think of that the same way as obesity. And so, because this has become such a big topic in the last several years, it's really important to kind of get out of our heads a little bit and stop stigmatizing obesity as something other than a chronic disease, just like any of these other metabolic conditions, right? It affects every single part of our bodies, but it always comes down to that number on the scale, and we need to start as a society stepping away from that and truly looking at someone's metabolic condition.
I think, and I'll just add on to that, I think part of the problem is exactly what you said. This isn't a 6-month treatment and then you're good to go. This is a lifetime of being on this medication for it to work properly. And this sounds like a utopiastic society, but I think the partnership between employers and physicians need to be strong in this on both standpoints. I think the physicians need to pressure their partners and the other physicians to prescribe this responsibly, to make sure that the people who are being prescribed this medication actually need the medication, it's being put into the right hands. And I think the employers, like we said before, need to put steps in place that it's getting into the right hands, that the person's not taking it to lose those last 5 pounds from the extra beers they had over the summer. It's the right people who are planning on being on this long term so you can see the long-term effects. So I think the relationship is something that's hard to track, but I think it needs to be almost a unwritten agreement between the physicians and the employers is, if you make sure the prescriptions are in the right hands, we will do everything within our power to make sure that it's covered properly, and we're going to get rid of the waste and fraud in those standpoints.
Just in terms of my reality, there is no conversation between physicians and employers. Those conversations are happening between the employers and the benefit plan. The physicians are sort of not ever been a part of that conversation.
Correct. They're not part of the conversation, but once again, we need to make, as a plan.
Education obviously does change that.
Education goes into that, but it also needs to be, once again, who's it being prescribed to? I think part of the problem we're seeing, or I'm saying from a consulting standpoint, you could probably say from the pharmacy standpoint, is these are being prescribed like water. For whatever reason, everybody's being prescribed a GLP-1. And that's causing, I think every employer, if they can get it into the hands of the people who would be responsible and who truly need it, would have no problem covering it. It's the fact that so many other people are taking away from those pots that it needs to be an unwritten agreement between the physicians and that we do our part, you do your part.
I just want to add one more thing. When we actually did put out a series of recommendations around how employers could think about coverage of GLP-1s about a year ago. And one of the sort of starting points was, A, we need to think about this as a chronic condition, and B, you should make your decisions based on the medical science. And the medical science says, once a person is on, if they're having success, they should stay on the drug. The idea that an employer or plan says, cool, you reached a healthy weight or a semi-healthy weight, now I'm taking you off, is just utterly absurd. I also saw I can't remember if it was Mayo or Cleveland Clinic, but for their own employees, in an effort to try to mitigate their costs, they're like, we're going to put a lifetime cap of like $25,000 or something on GLP-1s. I was like, that's the stupidest. Like, that's just the stupidest thing, right? Like, say like, hey, you can't get covered because you don't qualify under our whatever, but like, the idea that was like, hey, I'm more than willing to spend $25,000, then take you off, and then see the entire benefit of the $25,000 I just spent go away. Like, and it wasn't like some sort of company that shouldn't know better. Like, this was a place that absolutely should have known better.
So I can talk about that afterwards, but I don't want to waste time on it.
Okay.
I saw some other questions.
Hi, thank you. Great presentation, great dialogue. Appreciate all the expert insights. It's kind of a very frustrating topic for me because we look at the root cause of so many of our health problems in the U.S. and the wealthiest country in the world, or one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and we have these terrible health outcomes, can be traced back to this chronic problem of obesity. And we have this solution for the most part that's going to be a solution for vast majority of people. And this pricing issue is kind of blocking, that last mile between the ones that need it most and this solution. So I guess what I've been thinking about is like, when do the policymakers step in? And especially the president has been very, had a lot of rhetoric about pharmaceutical pricing and different ways to kind of even the playing field worldwide about pharmaceutical pricing. In my lifetime, I've seen things like Medicare Part D come to fruition and help provide more access for pharmaceuticals. But what are your thoughts about, can the government step in and broadly improve access to GLP-1s?
So that's one of the questions we had, so I'll plug it into this question so we could ask both of you, okay? Last week, Trump proposed equalizing the cost of medications here as internationally. So on that concept, and I'll plug this in and have you guys answer this, how can the government get involved? When will the government get involved? Will this plan work? And why can't we purchase them through Canada or through England? International sourcing of prescription is something, from a consulting standpoint, we do talk about. Why is that not a viable option for these?
Yeah, I'm always going to go back to, this is something that started in the 1960s, and most people don't even know the origin story of this. And the average price of a drug in the 1970s was $3.70. And at the time we were like, hey, let's create some tiers of pricing, and there's underdeveloped, and there's developed, and there's the US. And of course the US in post-World War II Reconstruction, we pay the most. And no one would know the difference between $3 and $6 or $2. It really didn't make a difference because no one in the 70s ever had the ability to imagine $1,000 a month therapy, or $100,000 annual therapy, or a multi-million-dollar cell and gene therapy. And so, we created this policy in which the United States just became a place in which anyone could just rubber stamp any price. And let me be frank and fair. The for-profit, spread pricing, vertically integrated PBMs picked up on this. And there's this symbiotic relationship, if you think about it. Who benefits from high drug costs plus high inflation? Both the PBM and the pharmaceutical manufacturer. Let's be frank here, because if you're making on a percent of drugs, you love expensive drugs, you love waste, you love fraud, you love abuse. You may not say it out loud, but it's the truth. You make more money on it all, and so does pharma. And so I go back to, this never should have happened. It never should have persisted. And people treat this like it's some sort of axiom, as if we've all agreed to pay for higher priced drugs in the United States. I point this out all the time. It's the same price for an NVIDIA 4090 GPU in any country in the world. And that is 10 times harder to make than any small molecule. So why can we have price efficiency from launching satellites into space to new cars to GPUs, but we can't have it for GLP-1s and small molecule? And before someone says that's not the way it works, I go to the over-counter section in any pharmacy and go reach for a bottle of Tylenol or Advil because it's made in the same manufacturing locations. And so yes, you can have efficient, fair price. It can be equalized. It can have equilibrium in the global markets, and we need to get here. Will the current administration execute? I don't know. I wish they would, because we would all benefit. There is nothing, I just want to make this very clear. I want to make one point, and I'll be quiet after this, is there is no other policy that could reduce drug cost in the United States to the same effect as equalizing costs around the globe for developed nations. Forget underdeveloped. It would cut costs by a minimum of 1/3, at most 50%. Nothing in any other program is going to get you there.
So the argument against that, and I'll ask from the medical standpoint, is research and development. The cost of research and development is the aspect. I'm not saying I agree with this or not, but the argument is it will affect research and development because they lose so much money on all these failed medications. Is there, and I'll ask both of you, is there truth behind that?
Every product fails, from cars to rocket ships. You ever seen SpaceX crash a rocket? Yeah, it happens. Boo-hoo, pharma, I'm sorry. You know, maybe that teaches you to be more efficient. Maybe it teaches you to be more frugal. But you cannot expect people to pay for your mistakes. I'm sorry, that makes zero sense to me.
I agree with you. It's outrageous. When, you know, another country in the world, in Europe and Canada, we can get the same medication for significantly less, and I know this because I have patients taking their scripts there. This is absurd. And so absolutely, like, there needs to be political involvement in this cause. I don't know if I see it happening anytime soon. I know, you know, healthcare is a mess. I will be the first one to tell anyone that, and I think everybody knows that healthcare is a mess. And costs are absolutely outrageous. I think it has created a lot of access issues. I think it has created a significant inequality in terms of who is able to get better healthcare or medication access versus others, and it's costing the country more overall. So it behooves this government to sit down and really figure this out. I've also noticed a lot of rhetoric around stigma around obesity, right? And, you know, not to get into the weeds too much about this, but again, people who truly understand the disease process need to be on that table making those decisions, and quite frankly, changing red dye is not going to change anything.
I know we need to wrap up. I'll just say, I hate to be the downer, but from a legal constitutional perspective, there's almost no doubt that President Trump does not have the authority to say we should just be paying the same price as everybody else. There's a reason why the Democrats, when they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was in some ways a similar general idea on a much smaller scale, went through the arduous process of passing it through legislation, and then the drug companies sued and said it was unconstitutional. Now, so far the law has been held up in court, and I hope that stays, but the idea that the president can sort of sign an executive order and make this happen is sort of absurd, as I'm sure we'll be finding out in the next couple of months.
So we're out of time. We could probably go on for 3 hours, so next time we need 3 hours for this conversation. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the amazing questions. And I'm sure everybody here will be open to ask questions if you want to walk over and ask them, but thank you very much.